Well, one of the goals of the Benson Center is to promote intellectual diversity on campus, and I think tonight's talk fits the bill. It's a pleasure to have Jonathan Keeperman, also known as Lomez, with us to talk about free speech and the arts. Jonathan is the founder and editor of Passage Press. I'll let him say a little bit more about himself during his talk. After the talk, there'll be time for Q&A, both from the in-person and the Zoom audience. So please keep questions in mind for the end of the talk. Without further ado, Jonathan Keeperman.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. I am truly honored to be here. For reasons I'm going to get to in my talk, lately I have not been getting invited to speak in front of formal audiences so much as I used to in a previous life. So the fact that I'm even here and at the Benson Center and you all were willing to invite me and work up the courage to hear what I have to say is deserving of some applause and something I'm very grateful for. Thank you to Joseph for having me out. Thank you to Professor Jacobson, the Bruce Benson Center, University of Colorado, all the guests in the audience. Okay, let's get started. So my talk tonight is called It's Only When It's Funny, and I'm gonna have to leave you in suspense until the very end. The punchline doesn't come until like the last part of the speech. My talk tonight, should I be speaking into this? I'll try this. My talk tonight is going to cover a loose constellation of thoughts and observations I've made over the last couple of years on the intersection of art, politics, censorship, free speech, creative private economies, specifically the film and publishing industry, especially the publishing industry, the degraded and sclerotic state of American culture. Finally, I will offer some thoughts on how to remedy the situation, both in practical terms, as a profit-motivated business owner, and as a matter of belief and orientation, which is the more important part, as a writer, as someone who cares about culture and art for culture and art's sake. This is a lot to cover. The level of specificity and detail sufficient to formalize these arguments is more than can be reasonably dealt with in a single talk. I don't have the patience or frankly the talent for that kind of thinking. Rather, this talk should be viewed as a gesture toward possibilities, towards experimentation, prying the doors open to new rooms and corridors for exploration. Some, perhaps many of which will turn out to be their own dead ends. This is as much a call to action as it is a diagnosis, a nudge toward a more productive and more open discourse. This is all to say that I want to preserve some degree of modesty in my assertions about the nature of the problems before us, and even more so about the solutions. As I will address later on, it is my position that pre-formulating the solutions to these problems raised here is the wrong approach anyway. The answers we are looking for are not to be imagined or hypothesized. The answers are to be discovered. And in fact, many of the problems we face now with regards to censorship are premised on the wrong-headed assumption that we already know the answers. As the philosopher Nick Land, here's my first slide, okay, it's working. As the philosopher Nick Land says in our recently published Xenosystems, a book that is available from Passage Press, that is my publishing house, quote, "The real problem of political philosophy does not lie in the conceptual effort of modeling an ideal society, but in departing from where we are. The initial real problem is escape. In other words, let's not be so preoccupied with where we are going, but rather, how do we get ourselves unstuck?" And in the interest of getting unstuck, I'm going to take a cue from a former mentor of mine who once told me that if you don't know where to begin with yourself. In this case, it's more than just a pretext for preliminary throat clearing. My biography and how I got to be standing where I am right now illustrates how ideological trends of the last decade, particularly how a virulent strain of leftism, progressivism, liberalism, Marxism, choose your fighter, came to dominate our institutions of cultural production, closing off certain kinds of vital speech and expression from public view. Firstly, I am a poster. What I mean by that is that I have lived a good deal of my adult life online. I posted on forums, message boards, wrote blogs, commented on blogs, in chat rooms, on every major social media platform since the concept was invented, all as an anonymous persona named Lomez, or some variation thereof. Simultaneously, as a day job, after a couple of fits and starts in tech and finance, I had a decade-long career in academia as a continuing lecturer in the English department at the University of California. My page has been scrubbed since I left a couple of years ago, but this remains. I taught classes on 20th century American fiction, the literature of conspiracy theories, technology and futurism, political rhetoric, and a variety of other topics, including a class I co-taught with a political science professor on free speech and the internet. And I just want a quick sidebar here, and I bring this up because it's germane to something I'm going to be talking about later on. It was during the year I taught the free speech class that I was called upon by a student to contribute to an op-ed defending Milo Yiannopoulos' right to come speak on campus after the administration had rescinded his invitation owing to pressure from student activists. This was my statement in the op-ed. We don't need to read through the whole thing, but it's just a boilerplate defense of free speech on campus, okay? Fairly anodyne. But later, this statement was used against me as evidence of my extreme far-right beliefs in a profile in The Guardian last May. And so I just wanna sort of let this pregnant pause sit for a second and think about why an anodyne defense of free speech like this might be used against someone as proof of their bad ideas. Okay, moving on. So my position at UC Irvine was not a tenured position, but by academia standards, it was a pretty good gig. I taught a 3-3-2 schedule. I had tenure equivalent security of employment. I had near total autonomy over my curriculum. I held positions as a program director, served on hiring committees, co-wrote textbooks, spoke at conferences, had papers published, and I got 4 months off every year in the summer to pursue my private intellectual interests. I had glowing reviews from students and fellow faculty alike. And I even won some not insignificant awards for my teaching and my work. I say this not for just self-aggrandizing purposes, but to emphasize that however modest my station at the university, I had made a nice life for myself inside of academia. I belong there. However, to the question of where I found a meaningful life of the mind, where I could test ideas, where I could come into contact with deeply learned, deeply insightful, curious, and generous minds on all subject matter, it was decidedly not in the faculty lounge. It was not in the classroom. It was not in the campus pub. It was not among my colleagues who were either almost totally focused on union organizing on the one hand, or interdepartmental politics on the other hand. Rather, where I found what I was looking for intellectually and creatively was on the outside of the prescribed boundaries of academia, of quote, official intellectual life, on the outside of the jurisdiction of epistemic authority, on the outside of the Overton window. I tweeted about this shortly after my docs, and I'm going to share a little bit of this. I'll just read the first few here. When I first came to Twitter, and even before that, in comment sections at various blogs like UR and Xenosystems and iSteve, what drew me to these places was a spirit of open intellectual inquiry, experimentation of ideas, and a sense of play, of humor. This was totally at odds with the academic environment that was and still is ruled by prescriptive thinking, dogma, I apologize, not all academics, okay, and witless, self-serious pretension. constipated intellectuals tickled by the overwrought contortions required to squeeze out a fart. Okay, you know, again, this is a different medium. On here, and by here I mean online, on Twitter, there were no rules. No ideas were off limits. Experts in every field could school you on any subject, book, or thinker, and the mask of anonymity stripped this space of the petty status jockeying you encountered virtually anywhere else. All that mattered, all that counted for anything, was whether you had something interesting to say, whether you were funny. There was no agenda, no ideology, no movement. How absurd. Again, I apologize to all the academics in the room, not all academics, okay? Wait, we're not quite there yet. Okay, so what I found online was that I was not alone. Many of the other anonymous accounts I encountered were also dissatisfied academics, artists, filmmakers, musicians, writers, lots and lots of writers, and a broad spectrum of highly credentialed and highly accomplished professionals who nonetheless felt constrained by the environment in which they were working. Though they were anonymous, it was fairly apparent that the people behind these accounts tended to be 1, men, 2, white, and 3, on the political right, though largely hostile to the pre-Trump conservative movement. And as an addendum here, it is a mistake outsiders make to think this community was primarily ideologically motivated. This is because outsiders looking into this scene tend to focus on its most ideological personalities and pronouncements, and because it's on ideological grounds that this discourse community is most legible to outsiders. But ideology or political movement, but actually if you look at a list of figures from this scene, and this is a Wikipedia list of what people have called frog Twitter. I disavow, okay? But actually, if you look at figures associated with the scene, there's no coherent ideology or political movement except as a secondary matter. And in subsequent years, many of these personalities have scattered to all parts of the ideological map. It's no coincidence that the formation of this community coincided with the rise of wokeism. I do not intend on getting into a discussion of what wokeism is exactly, what it means, its etiology. Excuse me, let me page here. Okay, its etiology or anything like that. It's sufficient to merely stipulate that a profound, far-reaching cultural and political shift took place from the 2010s, peaking circa 2020 during COVID, where progressive ideas on race, gender, sexuality, and identity became the dominant cultural ethos, and dissent from which carried a range of social, professional, and even institutional punishments. We will call this general trend wokeism, though I'd be happy to use any other placeholder you'd like, and this period, the Great Awakening. It is perhaps an indication, I should say, that this movement has since paused, if not reversed, by the fact that I'm here speaking in this room right now. I don't think this would have been possible even 2 years ago. So while it may be evident to many in this room, I do want to take the middle portion of this talk to establish that this new political dispensation has been accompanied by, and in fact depends on, a particularly potent and insidious form of censorship that is largely implicit and informal, which is why so many of us operating in a discursive mode outside of wokeism, often in direct antagonism to it, were relegated to lives of online anonymity, despite, in my own case anyway, ostensibly having the platforms to express ourselves publicly. Okay. While much of the ill effects of the Great Awakening, particularly as they apply to open inquiry and free speech, are embedded in law, particularly civil rights law. This is Richard Hananian's book, The Origins of Woke, in which he diagnoses wokeism as a consequence of various civil rights laws and an inversion in corporate and formal structures towards legal liability. That was his argument. It's fairly compelling. Christopher Caldwell has a book called Age of Entitlement that makes a somewhat similar argument. And I also want to add, though, that wokeism has begun to encroach on the First Amendment. So there are cases certainly and trends, or were trends, suggesting that this new dispensation was going to have an effect on the First Amendment. However, the majority of censorship, especially in matters of art and culture, are not enforced by the state, and instead operate through a pervasive, decentralized network of self-reinforcing norms and practices. Again, many on the right and even many liberals take this for granted, but I think it's worth articulating and mapping out as best we can how exactly these censorship mechanisms work. Some, such as myself, have used the metaphor of the longhouse to describe the broader constellation of cultural attitudes that define our predicament. According to this critique, our social constraints and the kinds of censorship that arises from them depend on social arrangements that emphasize, quote, female modes of governance, where consensus and the prohibition on offense, and in particular harm is really the key word in all of this, an emphasis and an obsession with an idea of safety, take precedence over truth-seeking. Others, such as Jonathan Haidt, have written about this at length, and there is much to be gleaned from viewing the censorship regime through this lens. Perhaps most importantly, under the Longhouse rules of conduct, the instinct for iconoclasm, for provocation, for wild, unrestrained, visionary arrogance is throttled or passed over for the safe and the familiar. This may serve the objective of the HR department, but for art, this attitude is death. The Longhouse is one piece of it, but I want to take a more direct route to the problem. I will argue our current censorship regime prescribed by wokeness happens across 4 overlapping dimensions. It censors people, i.e. content creators. It censors content. It censors content as a function of the people who make it. And lastly, this censorship is not just exclusionary. It's not just about limiting what gets said and by whom, but produces its own self-reinforcing boundaries, its own discursive norms that shape the meta question of what is even subject to debates over censorship. As a general statement, wokeness establishes its own discursive regime where certain people and ideas, especially those aligned with progressive identity politics, are given legitimacy, while others, particularly those from conservative or traditional perspectives, are marginalized or rendered unspeakable. Objections to this regime, or questions over what is or is not admissible as objections to the regime, are themselves tightly controlled and ruthlessly enforced. So for example, this is where my defense of Milo comes in. My defense of him on free speech grounds in this regime becomes inadmissible as an illegitimate critique. If this sounds like an inversion of old lefty critical theory, well, it more or less is. The left of yesteryear, while catastrophically wrong on many fundamental questions, nonetheless produced a range of useful diagnostic insights on how structures of power operate in the modern context. And so, at least in part for the sake of modeling what a more ecumenical approach to discourse might look like, I'll be relying on Foucault and other Marxist thinkers to help make my point here. Okay, but before we get to that, the easy stuff. So first, we have the obvious mechanism of excluding artists for who they are. The choice for exclusion from the official discourse is made independently of the content of their work. That's the important fact of this first mechanism of censorship. It has nothing to do with the things they're actually producing in the artistic space. This is the familiar case of cancel culture. Probably not worth going into too much analysis on this, as it's already been talked about ad nauseum, and I have time limits here. But here are a few examples. So Louis C.K. is one. Gina Carano is an actress who supported Trump. She's another one. Roseanne Barr, whose show got canceled. There's an author named Blake Bailey. He was the official biographer of Philip Roth, whose book got canceled for things he had done completely outside of his work. And then Ariel Pink. Ariel Pink's a musician. You may or may not know him. He had his tour and contract canceled because he went to a Trump rally. You know, it's worth saying that, like, in some cases, these people have actually done bad things, okay? So that's fine to acknowledge that. Nonetheless, we need to make some analysis about whether or not that ought to exclude their expression, their art, from public viewing. So we could also talk about, like, Roman Polanski in this context. So what's happening here is these people are marked out as bad. They have done something bad or have bad beliefs, and the judgment of whether or not they are bad and undeserving of an audience are made independently of the quality of their artistic work. The second vector of exclusion is based on the content of the given work. Work deemed problematic or insensitive or, again, harmful is deemed unfit for public consumption. This can be applied retroactively, as in the case of Dr. Seuss, or at the doorstep of public release. So in doing my research on this talk, I was trying to find cases that, you know, I hoped would really illustrate the problem. And so the one I found was this novelist, Bruce Wagner. Bruce Wagner, for those of you who don't know, was this sort of wonderkid novelist who wrote these LA novels. Force Majeure is maybe his best known one. And in 2000, I want to say 16, I could have that date slightly wrong, he wrote a book called The Marvel Universe Origin Stories. The novel, which was already under contract from his publisher, was subjected to review from a body sensitivity reader who objected to a character named Fat Joan. Fat Joan was a 500-pound character in this book. The publisher, on account of the review from the body sensitivity reader, asked Wagner to remove the word fat from the character name of Fat Joan. They said, why don't you just name her Joan? Wagner refused the publisher's demands to rewrite the character, and his book was subsequently dropped. Okay, so now, and so these are examples of this second form of censorship, but I want to take a slight detour now to remember an early-ish indicator of where this current iteration of content suppression began. And it's important to keep in mind here as well, censorship like this has sort of always existed. Artists have always been sort of excluded from the public sphere for who they are, you know, Oscar Wilde or something, or for the content of books. So this is nothing new as a sort of at the top level of that abstraction. But this particular sort of form of suppression is distinct from previous versions. And so one early indicator of this new form of suppression, or anyway, a key inflection point along the way, is an episode that's particularly relevant to me because it was when I was in my third year teaching at UC Irvine, and it was the first time I remember thinking to myself, okay, something really bad is going on here. We're headed down a really dark path. And I'm speaking here of the 2015 massacre of the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists, okay? Which some of you may or may not remember. Basically, there's this irreverent magazine in France. They, you know, sort of make it their mission to offend everybody. And they were publishing these pictures of Muhammad, which of course is in violation of you know, Muslim law, and some Muslim extremists went into the offices of Charlie Hebdo and murdered the cartoonists in a very, like, grisly, just brutal fashion. So while the attack itself was an act of violent censorship, the response to it by the culturati writ large, in my view, was a far more insidious form of what I'll call here intellectual complicity that shaped the moral logic of the subsequent waves of artistic censorship that followed. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, PEN, which is a speech and expression organization, I think it stands for Poets, Essayists, and Novelists, awarded Charlie Hebdo posthumously for a Courage in Free Speech Award. which seemed perfectly fitting for the occasion. But then, surprisingly, to me anyway, was met with a raft of criticism that attempted to excuse the violence and create a new hierarchy of moral concern where acts of artistic and political expression were treated according to Vladimir Lenin's question of whom. And here's the statement that was signed by over 250 PEN members, including some very well-known authors. It was written by Teju Cole, signed by Joyce Carol Oates and others. And I think it's worth just reading a little bit of this to give you a flavor of the kind of response. And so this is directly from the letter. Quote, in the aftermath of the attacks, Charlie Hebdo's cartoons were characterized as satire and, quote, equal opportunity offense. And the magazine seems to be entirely sincere in its anarchic expressions of disdain toward organized religion. But in an unequal society, equal opportunity offense does not have equal effect. Power and prestige are elements that must be recognized in considering almost any form of discourse, including satire. The inequities between the person holding the pen and the subject fixed on paper by that pen cannot, and must not be ignored. Okay. If you guys want to continue with the rest of it, I'm going to carry on. So it is my argument that such responses reflect the extent to which cultural power can invert victimhood, assert new moral norms, and tacitly justify punishments against those who violate those norms, all without the need for any formal prohibitions whatsoever. Speech is deemed unacceptable in this case merely because it offends marginalized groups. The argument implicitly suggests that some ideas should be censored to avoid causing harm, but only one side of the whom calculus, a position that aligns with the kind of repressive moralism that people like Marcuse and Foucault would recognize as an implementation of the microphysics of power. This whom logic brings us to the third type of informal censorship, where the question of what is said is evaluated through the lens of who says it. Here you get censorship on the grounds of, quote, cultural appropriation, or the off-sided axiom in comedy that you mustn't punch down. An example of the former is my friend and former colleague Alberto Guyaba's novel, University Thugs, a book about a Black fraternity at the University of Virginia, one the author belonged to, where its members engage in various acts of violence and low-level drug dealing and find themselves caught between the world of the streets they came from and the possibility for white-collar success in the alien world of the University of Virginia peers. The author's Big Five publisher had high hopes for this novel. My friend was given a very nice advance, and Snoop Dogg had already optioned the book for movie rights in anticipation of its release. Here is a picture of my friend Alberto, who, by the way, still teaches at UCI, great writer, by the way. Okay, what happens next sounds like something out of a Daily Wire satire of wokeness, except it's true. The publisher asked my friend to revise his bio to mention his personal experience explicitly as a Black student at UVA. Only one problem: Alberto's not Black, he's Filipino. When the publisher was told this, despite already having the books in print and a marketing campaign underway and having met Alberto at least a dozen times, they pulled the plug on the book. This had nothing to do with the content of the book on its own terms, and nothing at all to do with Alberto, a POC from a working class background, on terms of his identity. It was purely a case of whom. Oh, okay. Okay, I also like to tell the story, this is a similar kind of story, of the poet Yi-Fen Chao. Yi-Fen Chao is an obscure poet, probably most of you don't know who she is, but whose poem The bees, the flowers, Jesus, ancient tigers, Poseidon, Adam and Eve was selected by Alexei Sherman for the prestigious Best American Poetry Collection in 2015. It's not my cup of tea, but okay, it's good enough to rise to the top of the pile at Best American, so it must be pretty good. What the editors of Best American didn't know, however, was that this same poem had been rejected over 40 times by journals large and small. Had the editors of Best American found a diamond in the rough? Well, sort of. Maybe they were more discerning as poetry readers, or maybe the reason the poem hadn't been selected on the previous 40 occasions is because Yi-Fen Chow wasn't an Asian American woman, but a boring, nondescript white guy named Michael Derrick Hudson. This caused a huge uproar in the cloistered world of American poetry. To his credit, Alexei Sherman, despite a lot of pressure to remove the poem from the book, insisted on keeping it in. But Hudson was, of course, ostracized completely from the poetry community and was made out to be the villain of this story. He disappeared. Nobody has heard from him again. And what we see here is the complicated matrix of discursive norms that dictates what is speakable, by whom, and under what conditions. This diffuse power manifests through cultural institutions, media, academia, publishing, and entertainment, which have become central in defining what types of art, speech, and expression are seen and what are not seen. If Derrick Michael Hudson writes a poem that gets rejected 40 times, can that poem be said to exist? And if Yi-Fen Chow can write the same poem and get front billing in Best American Poetry, can she be said to exist? Finally, okay, this is the more complicated part. Finally, this new dispensation not only excludes and casts out certain people and ideas, it manipulates the art and expression it retains in such a way that reinforces its own exclusionary tendencies. Again, Foucault is helpful here. His concept of power knowledge emphasizes that power is not merely repressive, but also productive. It shapes knowledge, creates subjects, and defines what constitutes legitimate discourse. Take again, for example, the case of sensitivity readers in literature or gender and race quotas in film. And the genders and race quotas in film now gotten to the point where, if you don't know this already, the Academy Awards have decided they will not give out awards to films unless they have the right number of people of color in their cast or working on the film. Basically quotas for these films. Foucault might say these practices impose disciplinary power onto the artist and his art, subverting his creative autonomy to the top-down dictates of the discursive regime in which he's operating. This shapes and constrains what is true by shaping and constraining what is permissible. So this quote from Foucault, I think, is useful here. Normalization becomes one of the great instruments of power at the end of the classical age. So I wonder what he'd think about me using it in this talk. So what this also creates is a kind of ideological test an artist must pass in order for his work to be received. And often, and importantly, the more absurd the contortions required to pass the test, the more valuable the test becomes. Take certain casting decisions on recent historical dramas. This is from Amazon's My Lady Jane and AMC's Anne Boleyn, which is part of a broader trend where historically incongruous casting decisions are made in accordance with new norms regarding politics and identity. I do want to say here as a caveat, there may very well be artistic justifications for making decisions like this, but it also reflects a willingness to subvert artistic integrity, sacrificing story and the verisimilitude required to maintain suspension of disbelief for the sake of signaling allegiance to new norms. To see how absurd this is, Just consider what it would look like to invert this image. So punchline. Feel free to laugh here. I'm gonna take. Okay. But then why? Okay, the question is why. Here's the explanation from Curtis Yarden, aka mentions Moldbug, channeling Foucault, honestly, writing in his blog Unqualified Reservations, which is also from Passage Press. This is a great quote. I love this quote. In many ways, nonsense is a more effective organizing tool than the truth. Anyone can believe in the truth. To believe in nonsense is an unforgeable demonstration of loyalty. It serves as a political uniform. And if you have a uniform, you have an army. This kind of ideological superposition over the art then creates the conditions for the discipline required not just enforce censorship, but police the boundaries of what kinds of questions over censorship are subject to debate. For instance, when diversity quotas are questioned, such critiques are often framed as defenses of privilege or evidence of a constitutional weakness on the part of the critic. Here you see terms like white fragility. Okay, to say anything in critique of this dispensation gets you cast as somehow fragile or weak. Similarly, when accusations of reverse racism are made, as in the case of Michael Derrick Hudson, those accusations are themselves cited as evidence for the need of the repressive practices under critique. When authors like Lionel Shriver challenge the idea that sensitivity readers stifle creativity, their critiques are marginalized and dismissed as ignoring systematic inequality, and the person leveling the critique then gets cast out into the bad person category, sufficient often to remove them from admissibility. Wokeness doesn't just censor the works or views it deems problematic. It also precludes the legitimacy of critique itself. Foucault's concept of power knowledge explains this perfectly. Wokeness produces a kind of knowledge about what diversity, sensitivity, and justice should look like, while simultaneously using that knowledge to exercise power over who can participate in the creation of such knowledge. In this way, wokeness creates a closed loop of validation, something like epistemic closure, where its own standards are constantly reinforced and shielded from outside challenge. As Foucault would argue, this system produces a field in which even questioning the mechanisms of censorship is equated with complicity and oppression, thus disciplining and normalizing the very idea of censorship itself. In a bizarre twist, this closed loop of validation can produce whatever kinds of truth claims about itself that it wants, including one where its own output gets recast as censored work. And I'm going to put up this slide here in a minute. I want you to think about that Moldbug quote about nonsense. Okay, so this is how you get, for example, banned books being prominently displayed. See if I can get that back up here. They don't want you to see the banned book. This is how you get banned books being prominently displayed and sold as bestsellers to a general audience. Okay, what could banned possibly mean in this context? Don't answer that, okay? Might hurt yourself. So how do we get ourselves out of this mess? What about the internet? What does it even mean to be censored when anyone can go online and say more or less whatever they want? Post videos, create an audience, sometimes really, really big ones, make money, gain access to relatively cheap production tools, self-publish their books, and make entire creative and intellectual ecosystems all on their own. Do these arguments about censorship even matter in this context? Sort of. We are at a critical juncture where a lot of these censorship mechanisms can be circumvented with online tools, but there are certain structural facts about cultural production and dissemination that can't be so easily interdicted. So, for example, Ingram and Amazon constitute single nodes of production and distribution for the global book trade. Amazon controls approximately 80% of the online book distribution market in the United States. This dominance includes both print and digital formats, with Amazon accounting for over 90% of the ebook distribution market, with an estimated market share, Ingram, on the other hand, holds a dominant position in the US book distribution market with an estimated market share of over 50%, and basically all of the distribution outside of the big five publishers. So the big five publishers have their own vertically integrated distribution arms. So anybody who's outside of that big five system has to rely on Ingram and Amazon together. And Ingram's on-demand digital grid, Ingram Spark, which prints books and delivers them to customers and wholesalers, and really, in some sense, is a single node of book printing that can erase, with one click of the button, entire publishing houses. For example, about a year ago, out of the blue, and for no publicly stated reason, Ingram turned off access to their digital grid for Arctos books. Now, Arctos is a controversial publisher whose most well-known author is Alexander Dugin. They do the English language translations for Dugin. They publish translations of political scientists like Ernst Nolte, for example, as well. And I will say what was interesting about this case is that Ingram, up to this point, had stayed entirely politically agnostic. Amazon had gone through its own sort of cycles of taking books off the market, which I'll get to in a second. Ingram had never done this before and provided no reason why. And so all of Arctos's books, their printing, their distribution, basically, when you go to Arctos page, you click on a book, it goes to Ingram's servers, they print out the book and they ship it to you, the customer. They were shut off completely overnight with nowhere to go. In 2021, Amazon removed Brian Anderson's book, When Harry Became Sally, over ideological disagreements owing to the book's critique of transgenderism. And in the same year, removed David Cole's Republican Party Animal, not for the content, but because of the author's past as a Holocaust denier. What's funny about this is David Cole is Jewish, nonetheless. I inquired to our Amazon rep about republishing Cole's book. He's someone I happen to know, and asked whether or not we could publish this using our agent at Amazon. And we were warned that if we did so, we could jeopardize being able to sell any of our books. They might pull the plug on us completely, even though doing so was totally legal and with the consent of the author. Nonetheless, there you go. At a lesser level, the book trade has roughly 300 sales reps solely responsible for the placement of books in retail outlets across the country. When your local independent bookstore, which is serviced by a trade organization with web pages that look like this, or Barnes & Noble decides what to put on their shelves, they are reliant on these very few reps to tell them what is good and what is not. Even among conservative-friendly distributors, of which there are maybe a handful, there's tremendous ideological conformity, and publishers who I've spoken to, even relatively mainstream publishers, tell me they have to code switch in order to package their books in order to sell them to these reps. And by code switching here, I just mean when they describe the content of these books, what they tell the reps is basically then they're less sort of ideologically conservative than they actually are. And that's the only way to motivate these sales reps to go out to the independent retailers and proselytize their titles. Here's one example of the conformity of the book trade. It's just another incident I thought was funny. Consider the case of Vanessa Place, a poet who helped select panels for AWP. Some of you know AWP is one of the largest publishing industry conventions in the world. In 2015, Vanessa Place decided as a conceptual performance to tweet out the entirety of Gone with the Wind. This was so controversial that AWP kicked her off the panel. She was subject to this whole cancellation routine and was no longer able to participate in her role with the organization. The problem here is that books need gatekeepers. Okay, what do I mean by that? Unlike music or even film, end users can't really test a 300-page novel in the same way they can a 90-minute movie or a 4-minute song. Reading a book is a major time investment. And so literature is dependent on tastemakers to tell readers what is worth the commitment. The informal power of industry institutions, awards panels, and distribution networks have an outsized effect on what gets seen and what doesn't. Film and TV have a similar distribution problem. Streaming services and theaters are closely hooked into the studio ecosystem and create something of a monopoly on visibility of their own that it has been difficult for conservative films to crack. But more so, unlike a book that can be written by a single individual with virtually zero overhead cost, film and TV production are collective enterprises that require vast sums of money and extensive teams of professionals to bring to fruition. Because of this, tacit and often very explicit blacklisting of conservative personalities is extremely effective. Because they are dependent on the support of the broader Hollywood machine, conservatives in film and TV are, in practice, forced into silence. In recent years, there have been attempts to address these structural problems. Conservative media outlets like the Daily Wire have aggressively pursued their own TV film production as well as their own publishing house. They should be lauded for these efforts, even if some of these offerings might be criticized for their lack of artistic merit. Independent films like Sound of Freedom, which grossed over $250 million against $15 million to produce, and the success of self-published authors like Bronze Age Pervert and Delicious Tacos, who, extrapolating from Amazon rankings, are selling 6 figures worth of books, point the way forward for commercial viability for titles that would otherwise be locked out of mainstream culture. Another sip of water while we enjoy this slide. Okay. So breaking the distribution bottleneck is a hurdle yet to be crossed, but the old adage of just build your own may be sufficient here. Much of publishing's distribution problems stem from technological change as much as from ideological capture. The sales rep model is not as relevant to an industry that is so dependent on Amazon sales, and new publishers such as ours are developing our own verticals that capture more of the margins and spread awareness for titles through new and novel means. But it remains the case that the real problem to be solved is a spiritual one, a problem of attitude and disposition. I spend most of my time speaking to conservative audiences, and what I tell them about art and culture is not unlike what I would preach to those on the left. Firstly, that the point of art is not to imagine some better world into existence or impose an ideological preference onto an audience. Let us do away with these kinds of moral pretensions. Art instead is about mapping out where and who we are. Art has long assumed this purpose. John Ruskin, the great 19th century writer, tells us that art, above our laws, above our accomplishments in science or war or industry, is the most, quote, trustworthy of our civilizational enterprises. As I wrote in a recent article for the American Mind, he says this because art is a naked, intimate act. It is derived from the raw human element. And in fact, art may very well be what at bottom marks us out as human. It is the sublimation of our deepest biological impulses into creative expression, into beauty, and finally transcendence. This is unique to man. At the scale of a population, a people's art is the clearest reflection of that people's way of life, because at its best, it is the clearest reflection of what it is to live, to suffer, to love, to fight, to die, to be. In this way, art holds a mirror up to the world and tells us what is. What this means is that artists and the cultural mechanisms that sustain us must have the capacity and willingness to be honest about what is, and to which its political programs must be subordinated. Art is chaotic. What is real is not always and rarely ever immediately apparent. Getting at it requires experimentation. It requires the unexpected. What constitutes good art is impossible to predict. We don't know it until we see it, and even then, it is not imagined or hypothesized. It is discovered, often randomly, or through the strange alchemy of talent and vision that cannot be accounted for by reason or even intention. It is also often quite bad, and most of which will be of no value to anyone. The conditions for good art require patience, require a tolerance for weirdness, for wild strokes of genius, for ambitious failure, and will almost necessarily, at least on occasion, produce outcomes that offend, challenge, and provoke against political sensibilities of all kinds. And yet, decisions have to be made. Resources have to get funneled to certain artists and not others. Attention at some level is zero sum. So how do we decide? What is our criteria? As a final outro, I want to return to something I said before about what drew me away from academia and to this weird world of online discourse instead. All that mattered, all that counted for anything was whether you had something interesting to say, whether you were funny. There was no agenda, no ideology, no movement. How absurd. As a publisher with a reputation for publishing controversial ideas and figures, I often get asked the question, is there anything you wouldn't publish? Surely you must have some bright lines. Would you publish a Nazi? Like a literal Nazi? What about someone advocating for genocide? Or someone who is obviously and unrepentantly immoral, however you want to define that? I respond to this question by referring to a scene from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It is one of the best scenes in all of film, or anyway has become something of a personal philosophy for me. In this scene, Roger Rabbit is handcuffed to Detective Eddie Valiant, who's taken Roger into his care. Eddie has been working to get the handcuffs off, and their attachment has nearly cost Eddie his life. And so here's the clip. I'm not sure, maybe if I just press play, it'll work. And if not, I can just, no sound. Is there sound? No sound. No sound. Okay, I'll describe what happens in the scene. Well, I'll let you watch it because the visual cues are good. So, Eddie's trying to undo these handcuffs. They've been attached together for a long time. And you'll see Roger here, he slips out. And Eddie realizes he slips out in a second here. And he says, do you mean to tell me you could have slipped out of these handcuffs at any time? And what Roger says is, no, only when it's funny. Only when it's funny. When you're funny, you can do anything. Roger Rabbit is a clown, and it's his job to make people laugh. But the principle can be applied to any artist. There are no rules. There are no bright lines. There is nothing you can't say or do. No ideas are off limits. No artist is off limits. The only thing that matters is if it's good, if it's interesting, if it's true, if it's beautiful, if it's funny. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Well, that was a lot of fun. And I won't say any more. We'll just open up things for Q&A. I'm sure people have questions. Start with Taylor.
So I think it's approximately accurate to say that the same production model of publishing that banned Tropic of Cancer, Lady Chatterley's Lover, also was the one that you're roughly, that's the target of your criticism. And so I wonder how important ideology is to this. Is this a complaint about the ideas, or is this a complaint about the strictures of that production model, a centralized, monopolized, cartelized model? And what we're living through now is the ability of communication costs are lower and ideas can get out there. People can run idiosyncratic presses that make money because the production technology has changed. And the ideas, they are what they are, and they're attractive, they're funny, but the ideas are kind of superfluous. I think Marx would call it like a superstructure.
Yeah, okay, so in the talk, I tried to include this brief caveat that these forms of censorship, particularly along those first two vectors, okay, where I was talking about certain people who are, quote unquote bad people, their art gets censored, and then there's bad content, okay, and we decide like Tropic of Cancer, this can't be seen in the public square, and so there's a sort of political fight, if you will, over whether or not it's legitimate to remove something like Tropic of Cancer from public view. And there may be a sort of infrastructure in place through the corporate mechanisms, through publishing, that facilitate that kind of censorship. And perhaps to some degree, this has always existed. I'm okay conceding that point. What I would argue though is, one, because it happened in the past, ought not to be a reason for us not to critique and fight it and push back against it now. So just because, yes, there were moments in the past where censorship existed, doesn't mean that we should just sort of accept that it has to be the case that certain ideas, certain books are excluded from the public square. We ought to have a kind of lively political argument over whether or not censorship is legitimate in this context, just as we did previously. And so part of this is just, let's engage in the debate, let's have the argument. The other thing what I would say is, and maybe, again, I'm maybe trying to protect myself from like getting over my skis, but like, I do think that there is something new and distinct about this current iteration of censorship. And I wouldn't say that the ideology is just entirely superfluous. I think the ideology, for reasons I tried to express in the talk, actually are doing something unique in a way to reinforce its own sort of ability to enforce and censor ideas that it doesn't like. And so one distinction I would make, for example, is I think previous censorship regimes might have focused on what we might broadly call like blasphemy, okay? Ideas that cut against some like sort of civic, religious understanding of who we are, if not explicit religious understanding of who we are. And those ideas were sort of cast out, and this is how conservatives censor across like lines of blasphemy. What's different about this form of censorship is it's cutting along lines of safety and harm. And again, I'd have to think longer and harder about what the implications of that are in terms of how difficult it is to overcome this kind of censorship and the right ways of defeating it, or what kinds of products like this harm and safety language sort of obsesses itself with versus the sort of blasphemy type of censorship. I don't have a great answer for you, only that there does seem to me a distinction between what we're dealing with now, or what we dealt with. I think it is waning a little bit, but what we dealt with for the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years versus what we were dealing with, let's say, mid-century.
To me, I think the way you framed it in blasphemy, a couple of your examples are almost explicitly, they used the holy word in our culture, which I will not be rude enough to say here.
Yeah.
And therefore must be cast out of polite society for blasphemy. I mean, you look at the Roseanne Barr and Gina Carano incidents, where it's almost word for word that they blasphemed on Twitter by saying something against a holy person in those specific words, right?
Yeah. And this is, it's not novel to say that wokeness is a kind of like pseudo religion and operates according to like sort of precisely the same guidelines as like religious strictures would. I do think it's interesting though that even though that's true, they still feel the need to justify it on the grounds of harm and safety. They like the difference between a religious person and a woke person, if we're taking this analogy seriously, is the religious person knows he's religious and is self-aware and sort of proud about expressing his religious belief. Whereas the woke person, even if he's acting in the manner of a religious person, does not think of himself as a religious person, does not think of himself as operating according to faith. There isn't, sorry, some sort of higher power of truth that, he is consulting and making these decisions. He's making these decisions along kind of consequentialist, arguments about who gets harmed and who doesn't get harmed. So that's the only distinction I'd make there.
Well, I wanted to just a little bit challenge your comment that the government doesn't have a role. I think a great example is Russell Means was working as an FBI, CI, for the American Indian movement, or the founder of the American Indian movement, probably came up with the concept of cultural appropriation to separate hippies from Indians because there was a massive alliance happening there. So just to think about, this is, and that's at least my question about the right wing being invisible.
Yeah.
That really you used the word, mostly you didn't, but kind of mixed the word conservative and right wing.
Yeah.
And I really think they're spreading apart, and because right wing was almost entirely invisible, and now it's becoming really, especially with the abortion issue, conservatism is shrinking fast. And so, but my question is, which isn't really a question yet, is about art. I think that right-wing art has been really prominent, but really invisible in the late 20th century. I think maybe David Bowie or Martha Graham are great examples of right-wing art that nobody considered. Like Martha Graham's another great example. The main writer for the New York Times was an unreconstructed Stalinist.
Yeah.
So people just didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly speaking, I probably agree with you. I would be cautious about defining art in terms of its ideological character, because like I look at something like, okay, No Country for Old Men, okay, like is that a right-wing movie? I think so. Yeah. I could justify that as a right-wing movie, but is it like how would we go about making that characterization? Or I mean, like a Cormac McCarthy novel or something. I don't know. Like I sort of try to shy away. I think, in my view, I take the position. I'm a writer. Firstly, that whatever kind of ideological character comes out of the art is a secondary matter. It's a sort of epiphenomenal of the production of art. The mental space, the spiritual space you're in to produce art is pre-ideological. And and this is where I say, like, look, if I'm right wing, okay, it's because I believe those ideas are true. And so if I approach my art to say, I want to make something that reflects the truth about the world and the experience of living in the world, it will be right wing because it tells the truth about the world. And if I thought otherwise, if I thought telling the truth about the world made it left wing, well, then I'd be a lefty. Okay, so, but that's secondary to the sort of act of creation, and I'm hesitant to sort of impose a sort of ideological critical lens on art itself, other than to say it's important that people who identify as right wing are given space to make art. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the talk. So my question is closely related to the first one. I want to press a little bit more on this issue of what you think is different about the current moment. So one thing you mentioned was that, maybe this type of censorship in the past involved blasphemy. I think that's probably not all that it was. So here's a bit of evidence. George Orwell wrote a very interesting preface to Animal Farm, which was not published for many years, and then eventually it was. And here's what he says in it. Unpopular ideas can be silenced and inconvenient facts kept dark without the need for any official backing. At any given moment, there is an orthodoxy, a body of ideas which it is assumed that all right-thinking people will accept without question. It is not exactly forbidden to say this, that, or the other, but it is not done to say it. Just as in mid-Victorian times, it was not done to mention trousers in the presence of a lady. Anyone who challenges the prevailing orthodoxy finds himself silenced with surprising effectiveness. A genuinely unfashionable opinion is almost never given a fair hearing, either in the popular press or in the highbrow periodicals. And one of the examples that he goes on to give is that at the time he was writing this, it was unfashionable to criticize Stalin in Soviet Russia, and it was okay to criticize Churchill. And the highbrow periodicals would not mention, would not engage with these kind of criticisms. And this, so he means this as, is it possible to have freedom of press? So it sort of seems like the phenomenon that you're talking about, was on display, right, with full force. It was not just about blasphemy. Now you could possibly retreat and say, well, so we should still fight it. And I would be on board with that. But do you think that there is some other difference that we can find?
Yeah, I do. I think, okay, so, from a sort of subjective perspective here, this one is different because I lived through it, okay? And so like, I didn't live through previous censorship regimes. And so the exact nature of this one, is very salient and very apparent to me personally in ways that a previous one isn't, but I know it's, not wise to just see the lens through, personal experience alone. I think one thing that's happened though is that we went through a period of censorship, and preceding this period of wokeness was a period of really maybe world historical openness. And so then retightening what's allowable as public expression maybe feels very jarring only because it's relative to a period of openness we came out of. I would also say though, that the logic of whom, which was something I talked about in the talk, where it's not just a question of what is said, but what is said by whom. And the closing off of expression to particular people for who they are, and then closing off further what particular people of particular, let's just say racial, for racial and gender reasons, being able to speak. Again, I'm sure censorship regimes have looked similar in the past, but relative to where we were 20 years ago, I would say that this is very new and very different. I could walk you through a number of anecdotes of, not myself even, but people I know in publishing who, whether they're authors, who are being told, okay, sorry, you're a white guy, we don't want any more white guy novels, okay? Letters from editors telling agents, not only initially we don't want any more novels or work from white guys, but after a period of exhaustion, then telling them, okay, we don't want any more work from, like people of color anymore, because that got exhausted. So making these kinds of determinations about art and content that were so explicitly and almost strictly dependent on these judgments about, facts about a person that, in my view, should have very little, if any, bearing on these decisions, is something new. So that's what I would say is a distinction here.
Yeah, I have a problem that I'm trying to work through in my head about the case with Yi-Fen Chen.
Yeah, Yi-Fen Chow. Yeah,
Chow. There's one part of it where your friend Michael Donald, I forget what his.
Oh, he's not my friend. Michael Derek Hudson. I don't know him.
Okay.
Alberto's my friend.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's part of that where, when I think about it, it could appear, right, that this person fell victim to some form of wokeism. But I'm also curious, like, how the market could reflect a bit, I guess, like of a fabrication of what is good art, actually.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking of the movie American Fiction. I don't know if you're familiar.
I haven't, no, I'm not.
Where there's a Black author who is otherwise doesn't want to be labeled as Black, but is a good writer. But in order to get his bestseller out, has to kind of acquiesce to tragedy porn, for lack of a better term. But that's a bestseller, right?
Yeah.
And the market kind of pushed it that way.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of like how perhaps the artist considers their art in a realm like that. Is this truly good, or is it only good because I have this particular identity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think if it was, I've written about this before. This is something else I got in trouble for. Colson Whitehead, I believe, was the author who was complaining about the fact that when he submits a book, he's a Black author, he's submitting his book and receiving awards and having his books judged on the premise that he's a Black author writing a Black book, as if that's a distinct artifact, cultural artifact from just a novel, okay? And whether or not you could be just happenstantially Black and write a novel that doesn't have to make as its primary interest to readers and critics the fact that its author is Black, writing a story about Black characters. And the story of, I'll get to the Michael Derrick Hudson thing in a sec, but the story of my friend Alberto, who's not Black, but writing stories about Black kids that he went to school with, suggests that no, the market doesn't want stories where, you know, there is a kind of death of the author, where the author is erased from the fact of what's in the book and we can just judge it on its own merits. What this sort of iteration of wokeness instead suggests is actually the most important thing, not even like a secondary or tertiary thing. The most important thing is the fact that our author is Black, or in Alberto's case, not Black. And I would say, yeah, that's bad. I think that's a constraint on an artist's ability to tell a more full story about the world, however they perceive it. And I think, to get to your question about Ethan Chow, Michael Derrick Hudson, so far as I understand it, is I would want something like, you know, what they've instituted in orchestra auditions. Okay, they have blind auditions. Okay, so the authors, imagine Alexi Sherman evaluating the submissions to Best American Poetry, but not knowing what the names are. That seems to me like a worthwhile thing to pursue.
Those studies. They fake those.
Well, I'm not saying that studies work, the orchestra studies work, but the concept of blind evaluation of quality in art seems to me at least preferential to this current thing. Now, the truth is, actually, I do think the character and personhood of the author matters, and it influences how they perceive the world. And that's an important fact for us to know and understand about their work. So I don't think it has to be the case that like we erase it from the equation completely, but it ought not to be, in my view, the central, if not the only thing that matters.
I actually would like to just sort of piggyback off this issue. Because it seems to me we're talking about, and a lot of sort of, I guess, your narrative has been about this sort of notion, it's focused on the supply side, that there's sort of a nefarious, you know, there's publishers, there's these institutions that are trying to tell us what we should like. But how much of this is actually, are you counting supply with demand?
Yeah, I mean, well, these are self-reinforcing things, I would say. Okay, something like, you know, they put out these studies all the time about the percentage of women who read novels versus men, and it's staggering. It's like 85 or 90% or something of people who buy new novels are women. But you go to a Barnes and Noble and you look at what's on the front table when you walk in, and it's just you know, collage of rainbow colors. It's, you know, bright pinks and teals and, you know, big bubbly letters, like you're looking at like teenage girls like Notebook, okay? Like, these are not books designed to appeal to men. And I'm sure the industry justifies that on the grounds, well, men aren't buying books. Well, part of the reason men aren't buying books is because there aren't male-centric stories and authors being put forward to men. And my evidence for that is, well, actually, we found an audience that is really hungry for these books. And the moment you feed them something that speaks to their preferences, actually they will buy it and they'll read it and they'll talk about it and they'll engage with the art precisely in the same way that this female audience would, if only it catered to them. And there are just like structural issues here. Like most people who make it through the kinds of MFA programs that get hired into these editing jobs and then they become agents or they get at these desks at these publishing houses are women, and they are picking stuff that appeals to them, and that's fine. But look, man, I'm really out here advocating for diversity. Okay, like we need more than that. We just do. It's bad. It's bad for all of us. It's bad to have to whatever exists of a kind of mainstream culture anymore. It'd be so narrowly tailored to one sort of facet of our society. We need stories that sort of edify our experience in the world, and we get that through art. And the fact that we don't have art that fully encompasses the experience of living is a bad thing.
Question over here and then.
Yes.
This was sort of piggybacking on that, but to look at the issue of what kind of art is liked. The one that came to mind was Larry Correa, who's the number one bestseller on audiobooks, which is a heavily male-driven format because it's listened to by truck drivers as they're driving around. And his books are about everything that you would expect would sell to men: attractive women, guns, werewolves,
monster hunters.
Yeah, you know the series. And so I don't think that there's been any sort of tremendous audience shift. I think that Jonathan's exactly correct that what we're seeing is a feedback loop.
Yeah.
Men aren't buying books because nobody's making books for men. It's not that men stopped loving books. If you look at the bestsellers, you're still seeing Gene Wolfe, you're still seeing J.R.R. Tolkien, you're still seeing C.S. Lewis, the great books for men of the past.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. Larry Correa's previous publisher is Baen Books, and Baen was sort of famous for their, sort of like military kind of / libertarian, right-wing sci-fi, people like Heinlein, et cetera. And the sci-fi market, like the entirety of the literary market, has been dominated by now what's Tor Books is the big sci-fi publisher. And if you go look at their website, it's going to say all the same stuff about diversity, inclusion, and et cetera, and okay. But then where is the equivalent for people like Larry Correa to go in the aftermath of Baen? And there's nowhere. Well, what I say is Passage fixes this.
Absolutely.
Okay, Passage fixes this. So we're working on it.
But even Tor Books, they get all their money still by reselling Wheel of Time.
That's right.
Which is made for teenage guys. I mean.
Yeah. Nice jacket.
Thank you. So you alluded, like way back at the start of the talk, you alluded to the idea that wokeness is kind of on pause or that's receding, right? And you talk yourself about growing up not in a censorship regime.
Yeah.
And the examples that you use as far as showing that there's demand for more than just sort of like the Barnes and Noble slop that gets cranked out is that, we put these books out and there's a huge market for them.
Yeah.
So would you say that there's a legitimate desire for what like Land would call voices from the outside or from the external?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And look, I can just say that our success over the last couple of years bears this out. I mean, when I started this project, it was something of a leap of faith. Like, how big is this audience really? If I quit my job and go into this full time and sort of take a leap off the cliff, what's gonna happen? Am I gonna splatter on the rocks because there's nobody there? There's no audience there to sort of catch my fall. And it's just the numbers bear out that there is an audience there. There's a sustainable audience there. Right now, what's interesting about like someone like BAP or Delicious Tacos, for example, Yarvin's another good example, is they're very good at self-promotion, which is a great skill for an author to have. But there isn't a one-to-one correlation between being really good at Twitter and self-promotion and being able to write really good books. So the guy who's really good at self-promotion actually doesn't really need a publisher, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. I mean, we have benefits, okay? There are things we can do for them that they can't do on their own as in the self-publishing environment. But what we need to serve is the guy just like toiling away in obscurity on his novel, who's, a talented, perhaps, generational genius or something, sort of shy, a Thomas Pynchon type character. He doesn't want Cormac McCarthy. Can you imagine Thomas Pynchon or Cormac McCarthy like going on Twitter? They would never do that. They wouldn't lower themselves to that kind of thing. So, and God bless them for it. But so you need publishers still to sort of find and capture that talent that's out there somewhere. And I believe it is out there. I mean, I've seen it. And that's what these institutions are meant to do. I mean, these institutions historically are meant to do. You go find the talent, you produce the content, and then your credibility as a publisher, as a gatekeeper of the arts, through this matrix of mechanisms, self-validating mechanisms through critical, like you need critics, you need awards, etc. You're able then to educate your audience on what's good. And if you feed them stuff that's good, they start to trust you, and then they start to buy all the other stuff that you make. And so you don't want to abuse that trust with your audience, but this is the purpose of publishers. And it may be argued that they're doing this, but they're doing this so narrowly focused on just like one class of person and writer and story, that it leaves then an open field for people like us, people like me to come in and try to pick up some of those pieces.
So I'm gonna read an online question and then hopefully we can squeeze a couple more in. And I'll bridge this. I feel that good art can always be done even in the most horrible circumstances. A proof of this is the literature made in the USSR. Many of the authors died tragically or had a very difficult life. Shouldn't the discussion be more focused on allowing people to make a living, allowing them more independence to pursue art in their free time instead of distribution networks and having a seat in Hollywood or big publishers' rooms?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point that art will kind of always find a way, no matter what. I do believe that, and even the most repressive regimes, that's like what I argued in my piece is that artistic motivation is at bottom just deeply human. It's biological, it's built in, and it doesn't need a sort of social apparatus to catalyze it into existence. It's going to come into existence all on its own. The question though is, as an audience, are we deserving of seeing that brilliance and being able to experience in real time the great works of art that are being made about the society we live in? And what I would argue is, yeah, we want that. It's a better and fuller experience of being in the world to be subjected to really good art that's all around you at all times. And so while I agree with this person that the art will be made, I also do think it's important for some of us in this ecosystem, that would be like a publisher. My job is to go find it and then show it to everybody else so everybody else can enjoy it too. But yeah, I think, he's right. The artist's job is just to make the art. And I guess it's the publisher's job, the distributor's job, the marketer's job to go out and proselytize that to an audience.
Dan, and then.
So, excuse me, there are two different kinds of narrowing that seems to be in the document. What is in the publication and distribution?
Yeah.
And maybe your company can solve that problem, or you sell perhaps the more Amazon and whoever the other one was. that I-
Ingram. Yeah.
Will, realize something like what Bud Light realized or something.
Yeah.
But there's another kind of, so I have some hopes for the market, like some people. There's another kind of narrowing though that you've alluded to, which seems to me to be different, even if related, and that is a narrowing in what the culture at large sees as being permissible to speak. So, if you look at sitcoms from 20 years ago, it's remarkable what
It's
people
crazy
could
what
get
they
away with. And now I'm told that whoever's streaming the American version of The Office has taken out the funniest by far episode of Diversity Day.
Yeah.
And doesn't distribute it. To what extent is that a market phenomenon, I wonder, and to what extent is that, what about that? It's narrowing, is
Okay,
that?
it's interesting that episode in particular because while I didn't have this in mind, my fourth point, which was what wokeness does really well is erase critiques of itself. So like the Diversity Day episode is the episode that's satirizing this ideological structure that I'm trying to describe with this word wokeness. And of course, that's the one that they would target for cancellation because that's where it's weak. It's weak against a sort of upfront and particularly humorous critiques. It really doesn't like humor. Speaking about it like it's a biological thing, and it might be in some sense. So yeah, okay. So is this a market phenomenon? I mean, I have a hard time believing it is because people want this stuff. They like this stuff. Like I don't think so. This is where, look, in some sense, I'm just like a, normie capitalist, like, oh, the market's just gonna figure itself out and profit motive is enough to sort of overcome any of this stuff. And if there's money to be made by somebody putting this episode of The Office out, or I don't know, I was watching a clip from the South Park earlier today, and I was like, oh my God, you could never say that. That's insane that they got away with that. So why if the market's not figuring it out, or can I make the case that there's something other than market forces at work here? And I guess the market answer, the capitalist answer to that is, yeah, there's a monopoly on distribution. There's a monopoly on visibility. And or what you might say is that the marginal benefit to a company like Netflix, let's say, for keeping that episode in is being calculated by the executive whose decision it is to make, not against potential monetary cost, but potential social cost to that executive. And so they're saying, okay, I could increase the margins of Netflix by some, fractional percent by keeping this in, but man, life's gonna be really hard for me. Like a bunch of employees are gonna be really mad at me. I'm gonna get all these horrible letters and emails from staffers. A bunch of people are gonna quit. And actually, in total, the cost of my time and energy to deal with that problem is gonna be greater than keeping the thing in. So even though the customer wants it and would pay for it, the punishment that this regime has figured out how to exact on decision makers in these various nodes is just really effective and greater than the benefit for keeping this stuff in. That's, on the fly, that's the answer I'd come up with.
So it's 7 o'clock. So with apologies to myself and one other person who I just saw raise a hand, we will close formal Q&A at this point, but Jonathan will still be around for a few minutes or however long. So feel free to come up to him and ask a question. Let's thank him again.
Yeah. I'm very thankful. I'm so grateful for this opportunity. So thank you all for having me. Really appreciate it.